Ethan cross-slid the unopened envelope beneath a stack of overdue electric bills like it was nothing. Like the gold-embossed seal of the Los Angeles Young Professionals Council meant absolutely nothing. Like Natalie's name printed in clean black ink on the front was an inconvenience he could simply bury under household clutter and wait for her to forget. She wasn't supposed to find it. He had counted on that. He had counted on her being too tired, too distracted, too wrapped up in the case files stacked on the kitchen table to notice one more piece of mail lost in the pile. He had been hiding pieces of her life for so long that it had become effortless for him, automatic, almost casual, the way a person hides things they're ashamed of but won't admit to wanting gone. She found it on a Thursday evening, pulling out a crumpled gas bill, and the gold seal caught the light. If you're watching this story right now, I want you to stay until the very end, because what happens next is the part nobody talks about. Hit like and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. The apartment on Cavendish Drive was the kind of place that looked like a life well assembled from the outside. 11th floor, floor-to-ceiling windows, a kitchen that had been professionally photographed for a design magazine 3 years ago, when Ethan had just made senior attending at Cedars-Sinai, and they'd both been young enough to believe that a beautiful kitchen meant something real about the people living in it. Natalie Hayes had moved in at 26, still carrying boxes herself because she was stubborn that way, refusing to let the movers handle her law school casebooks, even though every one of them weighed more than a car battery. Ethan had stood in the doorway watching her with that particular expression he wore when he was simultaneously proud of her and already calculating how to make her fit better into his plans. A look she had mistaken, for years, for admiration. She was 29 now, 3 years in the apartment, 14 months engaged, and she was standing at the kitchen island on a Thursday night in November, still in her work blazer because she hadn't had time to change, pulling unopened mail out of a pile that had accumulated over 2 weeks because neither of them had time for anything resembling a domestic rhythm anymore. The gas bill, a catalog, something from her alma mater asking for donations, a dry cleaning receipt that had somehow ended up in the mail slot, and then the envelope, thick, cream-colored, with a gold seal pressed into the paper like something ceremonial, something that had weight. The return address read, Ella Young Professionals Council, Distinguished Recognition Program. Natalie's name was on the front. Her full name, Natalie Christine Hayes, Esquire. She stood there for a second just looking at it. The seal wasn't broken, the envelope hadn't been opened, but it had been placed deliberately. She understood that immediately. The way you understand something physical before your brain is caught up with the logic of it. Beneath the gas bill and the catalog and the dry cleaning receipt, near the bottom of the stack, in the exact position where something goes when someone wants it to disappear without throwing it away. She opened it carefully, the way she opened documents she expected to be difficult. Inside was a letter printed on heavy paper, the kind that costs money to produce. The first line read, Dear Ms. Hayes, it is our honor to inform you that you have been selected as one of this year's 15 recipients of the Distinguished Recognition Award, presented annually to Los Angeles' most influential young professionals under the age of 35. There was a date for the gala, 3 weeks away, a downtown venue, black tie. A note that this was her second notification, as the first letter had gone unanswered, and they wanted to ensure she had received the honor before the RSVP deadline passed. Second notification. Natalie read that line twice. Then she set the letter down on the kitchen island and stood very still for a moment, listening to the apartment. The refrigerator hummed. The city moved 17 floors below. Somewhere down the hall, the shower was running. Ethan, home from a 12-hour shift, decompressing under hot water the way he always did after a long day, like the hospital could be washed off if you stood under the spray long enough. She picked up the letter again. Read it from the beginning. Read it to the end. Folded it once along its original crease and held it in both hands. The first letter had gone unanswered. She had never seen a first letter. Ethan came out of the bathroom 20 minutes later in a gray t-shirt and sweats, toweling his hair, and he stopped when he saw her sitting at the island with the letter in front of her and her work blazer still on and her face arranged in the careful, neutral expression she used in depositions when she needed to hear someone's full answer before deciding what to do with it. Hey, he said. Long day. Come look at this, she said. Something moved across his face, fast, controlled, professional. He was a surgeon. He managed his expressions the way he managed a sterile field, with discipline and economy. But Natalie had spent 3 years studying his face in the same way she studied the faces of opposing counsel, and she caught it. The slight tightening around the eyes, the half-second pause before he moved toward her. He came around the island and looked at the letter. "The gala," she said. "I've been selected. Apparently this is my second notification." She looked up at him. "Did a first letter come?" He pulled out a stool and sat down. He was quiet for a moment. Not panicked, not guilty in any theatrical sense, just quiet in the careful way of someone deciding how much of the truth to offer. "Yeah," he said. "It came about 6 weeks ago." The word "yeah" landed between them like a small stone dropped into still water. "Okay," Natalie said. Her voice was even. "Where is it?" "I recycled it." She waited. "I was going to talk to you about it," he said. There was a lot going on. The Harrington transplant, the conference in Chicago. I kept meaning to bring it up. But you put this one under the bills instead of bringing it up." "Nat, that's what happened, Ethan. This one came, and instead of handing it to me, you put it under the gas bill. So talk to me now. What were you going to say?" He leaned forward and folded his hands on the counter and looked at them, a gesture she recognized from the few times she'd sat in on his conversations with difficult patients, the way he composed himself before delivering news that he knew would be received badly. "The timing is complicated," he said. "It's a gala 3 weeks from now. Explain to me what's complicated." "The Harrington Foundation dinner is the same weekend." He looked up. "Harrington is the biggest private donor to the cardiac program. His annual dinner is one of those events where attendance matters, where the right people see you and make decisions about you based on whether you showed up. I'm already on thin ice with Morrison about the research budget, and if I miss the Harrington event—" "That's not what I asked," Natalie said. "I asked you why you buried an invitation with my name on it under a stack of bills." He was quiet again. "Because they're on the same night," she said. "Yes. And you figured if I didn't know about mine, we'd go to yours." He didn't answer, which was itself an answer. "How long have you known they were the same night?" "Since the first letter came." 6 weeks, she said. "Nat, I know how this looks. Tell me how it looks. I want to hear you say it." He exhaled, and for a moment she thought he might choose the version of the conversation where he got defensive, where he pivoted to his schedule, his obligations, the genuine weight of his professional pressures, all of which were real, all of which she had accommodated for 3 years. She had reorganized her own schedule around his hospital calendar more times than she could count. She had missed a friend's wedding shower because he'd needed her at a department function. She had declined a speaking opportunity at a law conference because it conflicted with a trip he'd planned. Small things, each one reasonable on its own. Reasonable, 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 until you laid them end to end and looked at the length of what you'd quietly agreed to give away. "I panicked," Ethan said. "Okay, I panicked. The Harrington dinner matters for my career, and I didn't want to have a fight about which event we were going to. So you just decided, without asking me. I was going to tell you." After the RSVP deadline passed. He didn't answer. "Ethan." She said his name slowly, the way she said a client's name when she needed them to understand that the thing they'd just admitted to was more serious than they realized. "Do you understand what this award is? This isn't a local bar association thing. This is 15 people in this city, under 35. I've been doing immigration and labor cases for 4 years, and someone at this council thought my work was worth recognizing. That is—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "That is not a small thing." "I know it's not a small thing." "Then what is it? Help me understand. Help me understand how you saw my name on that envelope, and your first instinct was to figure out how to make it disappear." He looked at her then, really looked at her the way he rarely did in their daily life, where they mostly orbited each other through the logistics of a shared apartment and a shared calendar without stopping to actually see. "Your reputation is growing fast," he said. "You know that. The Delgado case got you press. The wrongful termination settlement last month. People are talking about you in rooms I'm also trying to be visible in. Donors, administrators, people who write checks to hospitals. And some of those people—" He paused. "Some of those people have opinions about attorneys who take on certain kinds of cases. Immigration work, labor organizing. It's political territory, and I operate in a world where I need to manage optics carefully, and I just—" You're telling me my career embarrasses you. That's not what I said. Ethan, her voice was very quiet now. That is exactly what you said. He opened his mouth, closed it. You're telling me that the work I do, the cases I take on, the people I represent, makes it harder for you to be seen the way you want to be seen. She folded her hands on the counter, mirroring his posture from a minute ago, and noticed the symmetry with a distant, humorless clarity. And your solution was to hide an award with my name on it, so I wouldn't show up somewhere visible and remind people that you're engaged to a woman whose work they might find inconvenient. The refrigerator hummed. The city moved below. I love you, he said. I want you to know that's still true in all of this. I know you do, she said. That's almost the worst part. She picked up the letter, folded it again, and put it in the inside pocket of her blazer, close to her chest, which felt right. She didn't sleep well that night. She lay on her side of the bed, listening to Ethan's breathing even out into the slow rhythm of sleep, and she thought about the first letter. Recycled, he'd said, and tried to remember 6 weeks ago. What she'd been doing. The Delgado case had been in its final phase. She'd been working late every night, running on takeout and coffee, calling clients at 7 in the morning to prepare them for depositions. She'd been distracted, operating on fumes, trusting that the apartment was a stable thing she could come home to without having to manage it. That was when it had happened. That was when he'd made a unilateral decision about something with her name on it. She thought about the phrase he'd used, your reputation is growing fast. Not, I'm proud of you. Not people are noticing your work. Growing fast. Like something that needed to be pruned. Like a thing that had gotten out of hand. She thought about the other times. The conference in Chicago she hadn't attended because he'd said it seemed like bad timing. The Profile, a legal magazine, had wanted to run on her that she'd quietly declined because he'd suggested it might come across as self-promotional. The dinner with a senior partner at a firm she'd been considering joining, which she'd rescheduled 3 times until the partner stopped calling. She had done all of it herself. That was true. Nobody had forced her. She had made each choice freely, or what had felt like freely at the time, before she understood that a series of small agreements to make yourself less visible was its own kind of disappearing act. In the dark, she made one decision. She was going to the gala. The next 3 weeks were not easy. She told Ethan she was going, and he received the information with a controlled professionalism that was, somehow, more unsettling than anger would have been. He said okay, and moved to the other side of the conversation the way you move to the other side of a street when you want to avoid something. They maintained the surface of the relationship. Dinner most nights, logistics coordinated, the basic architecture of a shared life. But something had shifted in the air of the apartment, a new awareness that had nowhere clean to settle. Natalie threw herself into work because work was reliable. She had 3 active cases, a wage theft suit on behalf of a restaurant staff, an immigration matter involving a Guatemalan family who'd been waiting on an employment visa for nearly 4 years, and a class action she was co-counseling on behalf of warehouse workers at a logistics company. The restaurant case was the messiest. The defendant's attorney was a man named Kirkland, who specialized in delay tactics and had more experience with this kind of litigation than she did. She wasn't going to win on instinct. She was going to win by being prepared. She stayed late. She took calls at 7 in the morning. She drove to the warehouse twice in 1 week to interview workers who were still employed there and terrified of losing their jobs if they were seen talking to her. She sat in parking lots and took notes on her phone and thought about what it meant to build a case from the ground up when the person on the other side had more resources than you did. She RSVP'd to the gala. She bought a dress. That last part mattered more than it should have, and she knew it, and she was okay with that. She didn't want something safe. She didn't want something that would disappear into the background of a formal event. She found it in a boutique in Silver Lake, midnight blue, structured at the shoulders, a fabric that moved differently depending on the light, like it couldn't quite make up its mind. The woman working in the boutique said it was the kind of dress that entered a room before you did, and Natalie looked at herself in the fitting room mirror for a long moment and thought, yes, that's the point. She paid for it herself with her own account, which shouldn't have felt like a statement, but did. The night of the gala arrived cold for November, which meant 58 degrees in Los Angeles, and therefore everyone was dressed like it was February in Chicago. The venue was a restored theater in downtown. The kind of building that had been a movie palace in the 40s and had been converted and reconverted and preserved and polished until it had accumulated meaning from every era it had passed through. Chandeliers that had been there since the beginning. New floors. High ceilings that the original architects had built high on purpose, because they understood that some occasions required space above your head. Natalie took a car service because she'd made a point of not asking Ethan to drop her off. That felt important too, arriving under her own power, in her own time, without the implicit negotiation of a shared ride. The driver pulled up to the entrance and she got out onto a red carpet she hadn't expected. Camera flashes, a small crowd behind velvet ropes, volunteers in matching blazers moving guests through with practiced efficiency. She stood for a second on the carpet, adjusting her clutch, and one of the photographers called her name. Not guessing, actually called it, "Ms. Hayes, this way, please." And she turned and stood for the photograph because it would have been stranger not to. She went inside. The room was full but not overwhelming. 150 people, maybe. The kind of crowd where you could still have a real conversation if you moved to the right corner of it. Round tables set for dinner, a stage with a podium, bar service along the far wall. She took a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray and spent the first 10 minutes doing what she always did in rooms full of strangers, moving slowly through the edges, getting the shape of the space, reading faces without committing to conversations yet. She met two of the other honorees, a woman named Priya who ran a mental health nonprofit in East LA, and was somehow more nervous than Natalie had expected someone confident enough to run a nonprofit to be, and a man named Carl who'd built a solar energy company that was now operating in 4 states and shook her hand with the kind of grip that communicated both confidence and the memory of working with his hands. Good people, she thought, real ones. Then someone said her name from her left, and she turned. He was standing at the edge of the bar area, medium build, wearing a charcoal suit that fit the way clothes fit. When someone has learned from experience rather than trying, dark hair with the beginning of gray at the temples that put him somewhere in his late 30s. He had a glass of something sparkling, water too, she noticed, and was holding it loosely, not like a prop, and he was looking at her with an expression that was attentive without being aggressive about it. "You're Natalie Hayes," he said, "the labor attorney. I read about the Delgado case last month in the LA Business Observer." "That's me," she said, "Adrian Blake." He extended his hand. "Architecture. Affordable housing, primarily, which makes me the least glamorous person in this room, but here we are." She shook his hand and found herself smiling in the involuntary way that happens when something is actually funny, rather than politely funny. Affordable housing isn't glamorous? Not to the people who fund these galas, generally, no. He said it without bitterness, just as a statement of observed fact. Though I've learned that if you stand next to someone genuinely interesting, they tend to forget what you actually do. Is that a strategy? It's more of an accidental pattern, I've noticed. He tilted his head. The Delgado case. Wrongful termination, wasn't it? Manager retaliating against a worker who'd filed a wage complaint? That's the one. What was the outcome? She told him. He asked a real question in response, not the reflexive, wow, good for you she'd learned to expect from people at events like this, but a question about the specific legal mechanism she'd used, a question that indicated he'd actually read the article rather than skimmed it. She answered. He listened. He listened the way people rarely listened at events like this, not waiting for his turn to respond, not scanning the room over her shoulder, not checking his phone with the apologetic half gesture that meant I'm here, but not entirely here. He was present in the room, with her, following the logic of what she was saying. "What are you working on now?" he asked. She told him about the warehouse case. He asked about the workers, not the legal strategy, the people, what their situation was, what they were afraid of, what they needed. She found herself talking about the woman she'd met in the parking lot 2 weeks ago, a 53-year-old woman named Rosario, who'd been working the same job for 7 years and was afraid that a lawsuit would cost her the job before she could afford to lose it. "She's not wrong to be afraid of that," Adrian said. "No," Natalie said. "She's not, which is why the case has to be structured carefully. You protect the people who are still inside the building, not just the ones who've already left. That's exactly the problem in housing, too," he said. "You can't design for displacement and then act surprised when people end up displaced." They stood at the edge of the room for a while, not dramatically, not with any sense of significance, just two people who had found a conversation worth staying in. He told her about a project he was fighting for in South Central, a mixed income development that a developer was trying to convert to market rate before it was even built. He was frustrated about it in a practical way, not a performative way, frustrated the way you are when something you understand clearly is being made complicated by people with money and short-term incentives. She told him about a landlord case she'd handled 2 years ago that had taught her something about the difference between what the law allowed and what the law was designed for. He laughed at something she said, not politely, genuinely, the laugh of someone who hadn't expected to be amused and was caught off guard by it. An hour passed. She had not thought about Ethan for most of it. They were seated at different tables for dinner, but ended up near each other afterward during the pre-ceremony reception and resumed the conversation as if it hadn't been interrupted, which was its own small thing, the ease of it, the way it didn't require any social maintenance or rewarming. A woman from the council staff introduced herself and reminded Natalie she'd be called to the stage during the recognition ceremony. She asked if Natalie planned to say a few words. "I hadn't really prepared," Natalie admitted. "Just speak from where you are," the woman said. "The best ones always do." Adrian had overheard. "You'll be fine," he said when the staff member had moved on. "You spent 4 years arguing in front of judges. A podium with a friendly crowd should be easier." "Judges are predictable," she said. "Crowds are not. The crowd is on your side. They literally invited you here." She thought about that for a second. They literally invited you here. Not you earned this in the abstract, inspirational poster sense. Just the simple, factual version. You were asked to come. You came. They want you here. That was enough. She didn't see Ethan until she was standing near the stage waiting to be called up. He was there. She'd known he might be. The Harrington Foundation dinner was cross-town, a 30-minute drive, and she'd half suspected that once the evening wore on and he was left with his decision, he might find himself reconsidering it. Or maybe he'd always planned to come. She didn't know. She understood, looking at him across the room, that she didn't know him as well as she'd been operating as if she did. He was standing near the back, still in his dress shirt from the Harrington dinner, jacket on, looking at her with an expression she'd never quite seen on his face before. Not anger, not possessiveness. Something more complicated than either. She held his gaze for a moment. Then her name was called. She walked up the steps to the stage and accepted the award from a man named Howard Gresh, who ran the council and said things about her work that were accurate and that she would have been embarrassed to hear about herself in another context, but which she received tonight with something close to steadiness, like a person accepting something they had actually earned. The applause was genuine. She knew enough about rooms to tell. She stepped to the podium. "I represent people who go to work every day," she said. "People who pack lunches, take 2 buses to get there, and ask for nothing more than what they were promised. I started doing this work because I believed that the law was supposed to protect the people with the least power in the room. I still believe that. Some days it feels like the law disagrees with me. But then one of those cases turns, and the person who took 2 buses and asked for what they were owed gets what they were owed, and I remember why I'm doing this." She looked out in the room. "This award belongs to every client who trusted me when they had every reason not to trust anyone. I'll try to be worth that." She stepped back from the podium. The applause came back warmer and louder than before. She walked off the stage. Adrian was waiting at the bottom of the steps, not dramatically, just there, holding both their glasses of sparkling water, and he said, "That was good. That was a really good speech." "Thank you," she said. She took her glass. They stood together in the comfortable silence of people who have had a real conversation and don't feel the need to fill every moment. Across the room, Ethan watched them both. She could feel it without looking. The weight of someone watching the version of you they had spent years asking to be quieter, standing under a chandelier in a dress that entered the room before she did, next to a man who had introduced her to everyone they'd met that night by leading with what she did and what she'd built, who had listened without managing her, who had met her ideas with his own ideas instead of calculations about optics. She raised her glass slightly toward the space where Ethan was standing, not triumphant, not pointed, just honest. Then she turned back to the conversation. She had more to say. The car service home took 22 minutes, and Natalie spent most of it looking out the window at the city moving past. The orange wash of streetlights, the tail lights of other cars stacking up at a red signal on Figueroa, a man walking a dog at 11 at night, in the particular Los Angeles way where nobody found it strange. She had her award in her lap, a clear acrylic block with her name and the year laser etched into it, and she kept turning it over in her hands without quite realizing she was doing it. She felt something she hadn't expected to feel. Not euphoria, nothing that clean. Something more like the quiet that follows a long effort, the moment after you've finished arguing a case when the adrenaline has metabolized and what's left is just the fact of what happened. The fact that she'd been in that room, the fact that she'd spoken and meant it. The fact that for the length of one evening, she'd stood somewhere that was entirely hers, doing something that had nothing to do with fitting into anyone else's architecture. It was a good feeling. It was also exhausting in the specific way that reclaiming something always is. The effort of it, the muscle memory required to hold yourself upright in a posture you'd let go slack over years. The driver pulled up to Cavendish Drive, and she thanked him and went inside. Ethan's keys were on the hook by the door. His jacket was folded over the arm of the sofa with the careful precision of someone who'd come home and needed something to do with their hands. The apartment was dark except for the kitchen light, which he always left on when he was waiting up, a small domestic habit she'd noticed so early in their relationship that it had long since stopped registering as a gesture. She set her clutch and the award on the kitchen island, poured herself a glass of water, heard him moving in the bedroom, and then his footsteps in the hall. He looked tired. Not the ordinary tired of a long hospital shift, but something heavier, the tired of a person who has spent an evening in a room full of people while their mind was somewhere else entirely. His collar was open, his sleeves rolled up, and he was carrying the particular stillness of someone who has rehearsed several versions of a conversation and discarded all of them. "You were good," he said. The speech. Natalie turned her water glass once on the counter. "You heard it. I was there for most of it. I got there late. The Harrington dinner ran long." He sat down on one of the island stools, on the same side he'd sat on 3 weeks ago when she'd shown him the envelope. "I heard you from the back of the room." "Okay," she said. He looked at the award. "Can I—" He gestured toward it and she nodded, and he picked it up and read her name, turned it over the same way she had in the car. Then he set it back down carefully. "I owe you an apology, a real one, not a qualified one. You don't have to do this tonight." "I know I don't have to," he said. "I want to get it out before I talk myself into the qualified version again." She leaned against the counter and waited. "I was wrong to hide the letter. I was wrong to recycle the first one. I was wrong to think I had any standing to make that call, and I was wrong about the reasoning behind it. The thing I said about optics, about donors, that was—" He stopped, looked at the counter. "That was me dressing up something uglier in professional language. The uglier thing is that your career's moving and it scared me, and instead of being honest about being scared, I found a way to make the problem yours." The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a siren moved through the neighborhood and faded. "I appreciate that," Natalie said. "I mean it. That's a hard thing to say." "But," he said, "but an apology doesn't rewind the last 3 years." She said it quietly, without edge. "The magazine profile I didn't do, the conference I didn't go to, the dinner with Patterson I kept rescheduling until she stopped calling. Those weren't you forcing me. I want to be clear that I know that. I made those choices. But I made them inside a relationship where the direction of every choice was the same. Get smaller, make less noise. Make it easier for you to be seen without me complicating the picture." Ethan was quiet for a long moment. "I didn't say any of that directly." "No," she said. "You didn't have to." That was the thing that was most difficult to articulate and most true. The way it had been done without being done, the accumulation of subtle pressures that added up to a shape without any single moment she could point to and say there, that's when it changed. It had been a gradual thing, the way water changes stone, through repetition, through patience, through the sheer persistence of a current. "I don't know how to fix this," Ethan said. "I want to know how to fix this." Natalie picked up her glass of water and thought about that honestly, not about what she was supposed to say, not about the version of the answer that would move the conversation toward resolution, but about what was actually true. "I don't think you can fix it tonight," she said. "I think we need to sit with it for a while." He nodded slowly. He looked like a man who understood that sit with it was not the same as it's going to be fine, and who was honest enough with himself to not pretend otherwise. She took her award and her clutch and went to get ready for bed. She lay awake again for a long time, but this time, instead of cataloging everything that had happened to her, she was thinking about what she wanted to happen next. The warehouse case broke open 12 days later in the way that hard cases sometimes do, not through brilliance, but through one person finally deciding that the cost of silence was higher than the cost of speaking. Her name was Dolores Vega, and she was 41 years old and had worked in the logistics facility for 5 years and knew where every document was filed and what every procedure was supposed to look like, and more importantly, what it actually looked like when management thought nobody was watching. She called Natalie on a Wednesday morning while Natalie was eating a bagel at her desk and said, without preamble, "I have emails, internal emails. I saved them to a personal drive 18 months ago because I had a feeling this day would come." Natalie set down her bagel. "Can you be at my office at 2 o'clock?" Dolores was there at 1:57 in her work jacket because she'd come straight from an early shift, carrying a thumb drive in a Ziploc bag like she'd seen it done in a movie and wanted to be sure the chain of custody was clear. She was nervous in a focused way, the kind of nervous that had been sitting in someone's chest for a long time and was finally being given somewhere useful to go. The emails were better than Natalie had hoped for and exactly as bad as she'd suspected. A supervisor named Garland had been systematically documenting worker complaints not to address them, but to build termination files, paper trails engineered to look like performance issues, but clearly coordinated with HR to preempt legal action. There was an email chain in which Garland and the company's HR director discussed proactive separation of 3 specific workers by name, 2 of whom were among Natalie's clients. "This is retaliation," Natalie said. "This is documented, premeditated retaliation." "I know," Dolores said. That's why I saved them." "Why are you bringing this now? What changed?" Dolores was quiet for a second. "Rosario," she said. "They moved her to the overnight shift last week. She's 53 years old, she takes care of her mother. She's been there 7 years, and they moved her to overnight with 4 days' notice. That's not a schedule change. That's them trying to push her out without having to fire her." She folded her hands on the table. "I've been sitting on this drive for 18 months because I was scared. I'm still scared, but I'm more scared of being the person who watched them do that to Rosario and didn't do anything." Natalie looked at her for a moment. "You understand what this means for you. If you're a witness, your name is on the record." "I know." "They can't legally retaliate against you for cooperating with a legal proceeding, but the word legally is doing a lot of work in that sentence. It could still be uncomfortable. For a while." "I've been uncomfortable for 18 months, Dolores said. "At least this is uncomfortable for a reason." Natalie spent the rest of that afternoon calling her co-counsel on the case, a man named David Reyes, who'd been doing labor law for 20 years and had the patient, methodical energy of someone who had learned not to celebrate until the ink was dry. He listened to her summary of the emails without interrupting, asked 3 precise questions, and then said, "This changes our timeline. We need to file for a preliminary injunction to stop any further terminations before they push out everyone on the list." "How fast can you move on that?" 48 hours if we're not sleeping." "Then we're not sleeping." She called Rosario that night from her car, parked outside the office because she'd needed air and hadn't quite made it inside after David left. Rosario answered on the second ring, and Natalie could hear the television in the background and the small sounds of a household settling into its evening. "I have some news about the case," Natalie said. "Nothing final yet, but I want you to know we're moving faster. Something came to us today that changes our position significantly." Rosario was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Is it good?" "It's better than it was," Natalie said. "That's what I can tell you right now." "Okay." A pause. "Okay. That's enough." It was one of the shortest conversations Natalie had had with a client in years. She sat in the car for a moment after hanging up, looking at the parking garage wall, and thought about what it meant to have someone say "that's enough" in the voice that Rosario had said it, the voice of someone who'd been waiting for a long time and had learned to find footholds in small reassurances because the larger ones weren't available yet. She went back inside and worked until midnight, bummed. The thing about the gala that stayed with her was not the award and not the speech, and not even the particular quality of the conversation with Adrian, though all of those things had mattered. What stayed with her was the moment at the bottom of the stage stairs when she'd taken the glass from his hand, both glasses of sparkling water, one for each of them, a small and practical gesture, and the absence of performance in it. There was no "look how supportive I am" in the gesture. There was just a person handing another person a glass because her hands were full. She had thought about that more than she'd expected to. She hadn't given him her card that night. He hadn't asked for her number. They talked for another 40 minutes after the ceremony concluded, standing in the part of the room that had emptied first. And then the evening had ended the way evenings end, gradually, then all at once. And she'd said it was good to meet him, and he'd said likewise, and that had been that. She had looked him up, once, on a Tuesday night when she should have been reviewing discovery documents. The Blake Architecture Group, a firm of 12 people, a project portfolio that skewed heavily toward housing, affordable units, community centers, a school renovation in Watts that had been written up in a design journal 2 years ago. His photo on the firm's website showed him on a construction site in a hard hat, squinting into the sun, looking like he'd rather be there than anywhere else. She'd closed the browser tab and gone back to the discovery documents. Ethan was quieter in those weeks. Not coldly quiet, not withdrawn in the punishing way that people sometimes go quiet when they're angry and want to make the other person feel it. Just quieter, more careful, like a man who had heard himself say something true and was working out what to do with the truth now that it was in the room. He brought home dinner twice without being asked. He asked about the warehouse case, not as small talk but as a real question, sitting down, wanting to know how it was going. She told him. He listened. She could feel him trying, and she could also feel with a clarity that had been growing for several weeks that trying was not the same as changing, and that she wasn't sure she knew what changing would even look like from him. The patterns were too deep. The architecture of the relationship had been built around a particular arrangement of their two lives, and she wasn't sure you could renovate it without tearing something structural down. She didn't say this to him. She thought it at night and went through the days. She said it instead to her friend Carmen on a Saturday afternoon when they met for lunch at a diner in Echo Park that they'd been going to since law school, where the coffee was strong and the booths had patched vinyl, and nobody expected you to perform anything. Carmen was a family law attorney who had been through one divorce and was constitutionally opposed to romanticizing the institution of marriage, which made her one of the more useful people to have a conversation with when you were trying to think clearly about a relationship. He apologized, Carmen said. It wasn't a question. A good one, actually. Not a defensive one. And I don't know. Natalie turned her coffee cup. I keep trying to figure out if what's broken is something specific. The letters, the choices he pushed me toward. Or if it's the whole underlying thing, whether the specific things are symptoms of something that doesn't go away because he apologized for the symptoms. That's not actually a hard question, Carmen said. Tell me then. You already know the answer. You've known the answer for a while. The reason you're framing it as a question is because you're not ready to say the answer out loud yet, and that's okay, but don't confuse not being ready with not knowing. Natalie looked at her across the table. You're a labor attorney, Carmen said. When your client tells you a workplace is hostile, do you ask whether it's the specific incidents or the underlying culture? Or do you look at whether the specific incidents are going to keep happening inside a culture that produces them? It's exactly the same logic. Natalie was quiet for a moment. The diner moved around them, plates clattering, a child at the counter demanding pancakes, the particular low-level hum of a Saturday midday place where people are not in a hurry to leave. I'm not ready to say it out loud, she said. I know, Carmen said. I'm not telling you to. I'm just telling you that when you are, you already know what you're going to say. She drove home afterward through the slow Saturday traffic on Sunset, windows down because the afternoon had warmed up, and thought about what Carmen had said without trying to resolve it. Just let it sit in the car with her, taking up the space it needed. The preliminary injunction came through on a Friday. Judge Calloway, a woman in her late 50s who had been doing employment law cases for long enough that she had limited patience for employers who treated their legal obligations as suggestions, granted it in full, blocking the company from any further scheduling changes or terminations of the named workers pending the outcome of the litigation. It was a significant ruling. The company's attorneys, who were a large firm downtown with a reputation for the exact kind of delay and attrition tactics that Kirkland specialized in, had argued against it for 3 hours and lost. David Reyes called her when the ruling came through. How do you feel? He asked. Like we should keep working, she said. Correct, he said. But also, good work. She called Rosario. Rosario was at work. She'd gone in for the early shift, and she took the call in what sounded like a break room, her voice low and careful, the way you speak when you're at a place that's given you reason to be guarded. The injunction passed, Natalie said. They can't change your schedule or let you go while the case is active. That's a legal prohibition, not a promise. It has teeth. A pause. Then Rosario's voice, different now, something in it breaking open slightly, the way a voice changes when it's been holding tension for a long time, and something real and good has finally happened. So I keep my shift? You keep your shift. The sound Rosario made was not dramatic. It wasn't cinematic. It was the small sound of someone receiving news they'd been trying not to hope for, and the trying not to hope had taken something out of her, and now she was getting a small piece of it back. Natalie sat at her desk and let the moment be exactly as simple as it was. Thank you, Rosario said. Thank Dolores, Natalie said. She's the one who made this possible. She was leaving her office the following Tuesday evening, later than she'd meant to be, 7:30, the building mostly empty, when her phone buzzed with a number she didn't have saved. She almost didn't answer it. She was tired and the day had been long and the elevator was right there. She answered it. This is Adrian Blake, the voice said. We met at the gala a few weeks ago. I hope it's okay that I got your number from the council's directory. I wasn't sure of the protocol on that. She pressed the elevator button and leaned against the wall. The protocol is probably that you explain why you're calling. Fair, he said. There was a pause that was genuinely brief rather than dramatically timed, just a person collecting their thought. I'm presenting to a community board in Inglewood next month about the South Central housing project I mentioned. The developer is pushing back hard on the affordable unit commitments, and I need someone at the table who can speak to the worker and tenant protection angle. Legally, I mean, with the kind of credibility that comes from actually doing that work. I thought of you. She was quiet for a second. That's a real ask, not a casual one. I know you'd be doing me a significant favor. I'd also be happy to compensate you for prep time. This isn't a volunteer situation unless you want it to be. Can you send me the project documents? I can send them tonight. Then send them, she said. I'll look at them and tell you if I'm the right person for this. That's more than I expected, he said. Thank you. She stepped into the elevator. The doors closed. She rode down to the garage thinking about the South Central project, the developer's angle, the community board, the particular legal landscape of tenant protection in a project that hadn't been built yet, which was harder than protecting people already in place. It was an interesting problem. That was an honest reaction. It was also a convenient way to not think about the other reason she'd said yes without much hesitation. She caught herself in that thought and acknowledged it with the particular bluntness she applied to anything she was trying to be honest about. You wanted to hear his voice again. You wanted a reason to be in the same room as someone who looked at you and saw what you'd built instead of calculating what it cost him. She didn't think that was shameful. She thought it was information. The documents came at 9 that night, a folder of PDFs, development plans, board meeting notes, and a timeline that showed exactly where the affordable unit commitments were in jeopardy. She poured herself a glass of water and read through them at the kitchen table. Ethan came in at 10, home from a late procedure, and stopped when he saw the documents spread around her. New case? He asked. Not exactly. Advisory work. A housing developer in Inglewood is trying to walk back affordability commitments on a mixed-income project. She picked up one of the pages. The architect is fighting it. Which architect? She thought for a very brief moment about the most neutral way to answer that question, and then decided the most neutral way was also the most accurate way. A man named Adrian Blake. I met him at the gala. Ethan went to the refrigerator, got a bottle of water, stood at the counter for a moment. Is he the one you were talking to when I came in? Yes? He nodded. He was doing the careful face again, the surgical face, managed and contained. Is this a professional thing? He asked me to present to a community board, tenant protection angle. He's the architect trying to protect the affordable units. And you're going to do it? I'm reading the documents to decide. She looked at him across the table. Is there something you want to say? He was quiet for a moment. And then he said, not with accusation, not with the pointed control of jealousy being suppressed, but with a genuine tiredness that was more honest than anything performed would have been. No, I don't have standing to say anything. I understand that. He took his water and went to bed. Natalie read the documents until 11:30. Then she drafted a one-page response outlining the 3 specific tenant protection statutes most relevant to the project and what the community board would need to hear to hold the developer to the original commitments. She sent it to Adrian with a note that said, I'm the right person for this. Send me the board presentation date. His response came 8 minutes later. Thank you, Sending now. And for what it's worth, I thought you might be. She read that line twice the way she'd read the letter with the gold seal. Then she closed the laptop and sat in the quiet kitchen for a moment in the amber light, with the city moving 17 floors below and the award still on the corner of the counter where she'd left it the night of the gala, and thought about how much can shift in the space of a few weeks, not in the dramatic cinematic sense of everything being different, but in the quieter sense of yourself becoming available again to things you'd stopped noticing were possible. She wasn't done with anything yet. The warehouse case was still in motion. The conversation with Ethan was still unresolved in the large structural way that Carmen had named. The Inglewood presentation was still a month away. Nothing had landed cleanly. Nothing was finished. But something had moved. Something in her had moved, and it had moved in the direction of her own life, toward the cases that needed her, toward the clients who depended on her getting it right, toward the version of herself that a council of strangers had seen clearly enough to put her name on a gold seal. She got up, turned off the kitchen light, and went to get some rest. She was going to need it. The Inglewood Community Board met on the third Thursday of the month, in a room that had probably been designed for something else, a municipal meeting space with fluorescent lighting and stackable chairs, and a folding table at the front where the 5 board members sat with water bottles and manila folders, and the particular expressions of people who had been through many of these meetings and had learned to reserve judgment until the room showed them what it was made of. Adrian had warned her about the lighting. He'd called the night before, their third call in 2 weeks, which had settled into an easy rhythm that neither of them had acknowledged as a pattern, and said, "The room is aggressively fluorescent. I'm telling you now so you're not surprised." "I've presented in worse," she'd said. "There's also a man named Pruitt on the board, retired city planner. He asks long questions and doesn't always want answers. Sometimes he just wants to be on record as having asked." "I know that type." "I figured you did." A pause. "Thank you again for doing this. I know it's not what you usually—" "It's exactly what I usually do," she said. "The geography is different. The issue is the same. Somebody promised something to people who have less power than they do and is now trying to walk it back." He was quiet for a second. "Yeah," he said. "That's it exactly." She'd driven herself to Inglewood on a Thursday evening after a full day of depositions on the warehouse case, which meant she arrived at the board meeting in the same clothes she'd been wearing for 11 hours, with a coffee stain on her sleeve that she'd addressed imperfectly with a damp cloth in the courthouse bathroom. She'd accepted that she was not going to look polished tonight. She was going to look like someone who had been working all day, and came anyway, because it mattered. Adrian was already there when she arrived, standing near the folding table with a roll of building plans under his arm and a laptop bag on his shoulder, talking to a woman from the community advocacy group that had organized the turnout for the meeting. He saw Natalie come in, and something in his posture changed in the small way that things change when someone you were waiting for finally arrives. Not dramatically, just a settling. "You made it," he said. "I said I would." He introduced her to the advocate, whose name was Tamara Osei, and who had the brisk, efficient energy of someone running 3 things at once and doing all of them well. Tamara had organized a group of about 30 community members who were seated in the stackable chairs, people from the neighborhood, some with children, some elderly, all of whom had a stake in whether the development that was supposed to include affordable units for families like theirs actually included them when it was built. The developer's representative was already seated near the front, a man named Fenwick from a firm called Castlewood Capital, in a suit that announced its price tag quietly, who had brought 2 attorneys and a slide deck and the calm confidence of someone who expected to be in the room the longest and leave with what he came for. Natalie had read his company's filings on the way over. She had the relevant statutes highlighted on her tablet. She was ready. The board chair called the meeting to order at 7:15, and the evening began the way these evenings always began. Procedural, careful, each side given time, the board members asking their preliminary questions with the diplomatic even-handedness of people trying to appear neutral before revealing where they actually stood. Fenwick presented first. His slide deck was professional, and his argument was familiar. Market conditions had changed since the original development agreement was signed 2 years ago. The construction cost landscape had shifted significantly. Maintaining the committed percentage of affordable units at the agreed income thresholds was no longer economically viable without jeopardizing the project's completion. He used the word constraints 17 times. Natalie counted. He did not mention the people in the chairs behind him. Adrian presented next. The architectural plans, the construction timeline, the specific unit configurations he designed to meet the original affordability commitments without, as he put it with a dry precision that Natalie appreciated, bankrupting anyone. He had done the numbers. He showed them on a slide. The numbers were not dramatic, they were just correct. Then it was her turn. She stood up and set her tablet on the table and looked at the board members and said, "I want to talk about what an amended agreement actually means, not in the abstract, in practice." She walked them through it. The specific statutes, the state density bonus law, the inclusionary zoning requirements that the original agreement had been structured under, the tenant protection provisions that applied to projects of this size and this funding structure. She explained what the developer's proposed amendment would legally permit and what it would eliminate. She used plain language on purpose, the same way she used plain language with juries, not because the board members weren't sophisticated, but because precision and accessibility were not opposites. Pruitt, the retired city planner, asked a long question about the 1998 precedent in a comparable development case. She answered it directly and accurately, and he asked a follow-up that suggested he'd understood her answer, which told her he'd actually wanted to know. When she finished, the room was quiet, in a way that felt like something had landed. Fenwick's attorneys asked her 3 questions. She answered all 3. One of the attorneys, younger, sharper, tried to pivot toward construction cost analysis, which was not her territory, and she said, "That's not my area. What I can tell you is that the agreement your client signed has legal force, and the protections in it were built around real people who made real decisions based on the assumption that the project would be what it said it would be." "Markets change," the attorney said. "The families who planned around this development changed their lives based on what was promised," she said. "Markets aren't the only thing that changes." The room behind her made a sound, not applause, something quieter, the sound of people recognizing that something true had been said about them in a room where they were often talked around. Tamara caught her eye afterward, when the board had moved into deliberation, and gave her a single nod, the kind of nod that meant that was exactly what we needed. Adrian was beside her when they moved to the back of the room during the deliberation break, both of them getting water from a folding table against the wall. "You handled Fenwick's attorney better than I expected," he said. "How did you expect me to handle her?" "More diplomatically, you were surgical." "I like diplomatic," Natalie said. "But I'll go surgical when the situation calls for it." She turned her water cup. "The board is going to vote to hold the developer to the original commitments. Pruitt is on your side. His question was theater, but his answer told me what he thinks." "How can you tell?" "He asked about the 98 precedent because it supports your position. If he was against you, he'd have asked about the 04 case, which goes the other way." He looked at her for a second. "I don't know the 04 case." "You should. I'll send you the summary." He smiled then, a real one, the kind that involved his eyes, and didn't try to be more than it was. "You're very good at this." "I know," she said. It came out without false modesty, and she didn't walk it back. "So are you. The numbers in that presentation were airtight. I've been living with those numbers for 8 months." "It shows." The board voted 40 minutes later, 3-2 to hold Castlewood Capital to the original agreement. Fenwick accepted the ruling with the practice neutrality of someone already calculating whether it was worth an appeal. The community members and the chairs made a sound that was different from anything in the formal part of the meeting, something released, something that had been held in through the long procedural evening and was finally allowed out. Tamara grabbed Natalie's hand in both of hers. "Come back," she said. "Whatever you're charging, come back." Tonight was a favor," Natalie said. "Next time I'll send a proper engagement letter." "Deal." Outside, the evening had turned cool in the way Inglewood evenings turned cool, fast, and with a smell of eucalyptus from somewhere nearby that had no business being as pleasant as it was after 4 hours in a fluorescent room. She and Adrian stood in the parking lot near her car with the looseness of people who had just finished something difficult together. "I'm buying you dinner," he said, "or coffee, or whatever you can manage at 9 at night after a full day." "Coffee," she said. "Actual coffee. Not the kind that comes from a foil packet." There was a diner 3 blocks away, the kind that had been there since the 70s and intended to remain, with a counter and round stools and a coffee machine that produced something honest and strong. They sat across from each other in a booth, and Natalie drank her coffee and let the tension of the day finish metabolizing. And they talked the way they'd been talking since the gala, easily, following each thought where it went, without the social maintenance that most conversations required. He asked about the warehouse case. She told him about Dolores and the thumb drive and the preliminary injunction and Rosario and the overnight shift. He listened to all of it, including the parts that were procedurally dense, and his questions showed he'd followed the logic. "What happens next?" he asked. "Discovery. Then probably a settlement offer from the company. Kirkland, their attorney, prefers settlement to trial because it limits the public record. But our leverage position is better now than it was, so the offer is going to have to be real." "What does real mean?" "Back wages for everyone on the list. Reinstatement for the 3 who were already terminated. Structural changes to how complaints are handled. Monitored compliance for 3 years." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "Kirkland is going to push back on the monitoring. That's the thing he hates most, having someone looking over his client's shoulder. But that's also the thing that matters most for the people who are still working there." "So you won't give it up?" "I won't give it up." He nodded. "That's the same problem in housing," he said. "Getting a commitment on paper is one thing. Getting someone to actually hold the developer to it over time is—" He gestured. "That's the whole fight, usually." "Tonight helped," she said. "Tonight helped," he agreed. "We'll see what Fenwick does next." He turned his coffee cup. "Can I ask you something that's not about either of our cases?" She looked at him. "Are you okay?" He said it simply, without preamble. Not professionally, in general. It was a direct question, and she received it as one. She thought about it honestly before answering, which was something she didn't always do when people asked questions like that. The reflexive fine was usually faster and easier. "I'm in the middle of something," she said, "in my life. A decision I know I need to make, but haven't made yet because making it means a lot of other things become real." "Okay," he said. He didn't press, didn't ask what it was. "I'm okay," she said. "I'm just not finished yet." "That's a fair place to be," he said. They finished their coffee. He picked up the check before she could, which she allowed because she was too tired to argue about it, and because it was a small thing done without ceremony. They walked back to their cars. "The summary of the 2004 case," he said. "You'll actually send it?" "I'll send it tomorrow." "Then I'll look for it tomorrow." She drove home on the 110, the freeway mostly clear at this hour. The city spread out on either side of her in its late-night configuration, the way Los Angeles looked when most of its performance had been put away, and what was left was just the bones of the thing, the actual place underneath the version it showed during the day. She sent Ethan the text the next morning. Not from bed. She'd been up for an hour, had coffee, had stood at the window watching the Cavendish Drive street come to life, in the slow way it came to life on Friday mornings. The text was not long. It said, "Can we talk tonight? Not logistics. I mean actually talk." He answered within minutes. "Yes, I'll be home by 7. She spent the day at her office without the particular restless unfocus that had been following her around for weeks. Something about having said not finished yet out loud had settled something. The acknowledgement that she was still in motion, still choosing, that the decision existed and was real and was hers. She called Carmen at noon. "I'm going to tell him tonight." Carmen was quiet for a second. "Tell him what specifically?" "That I don't think we can rebuild what we had. That I don't think what we had was something I want to rebuild, even if we could. That I want to end the engagement." "How are you feeling?" "Clear," Natalie said. "I thought I'd feel something more complicated than that, but mostly I feel clear." "Clear is good," Carmen said. "Clear is hard to earn." "Yeah," Natalie said. "I know." She worked through the afternoon. At 4:30, she got a call from David Reyes. Kirkland's office had reached out requesting an informal discussion about settlement terms. David's voice had the precise, professionally restrained quality of someone who was pleased but didn't want to be jinxed. "Early," he said. "Earlier than I expected. The injunction rattled them." "What are they proposing?" "Nothing specific yet. They want to call Monday exploratory." "Let them explore," she said. "But our bottom line doesn't move, not on the monitoring." "Understood. Are you ready for Monday?" "I'll be ready." She drove home at 6:30, and Ethan was there at 7, as he'd said, in the particular punctuality that came from someone who understood the weight of the conversation being scheduled. He'd changed out of his hospital clothes, jeans, a plain shirt, and he looked at her when she came in with an expression that was exhausted and resigned and in its own way more honest than many of his expressions had been over the past month. They sat at the kitchen table, Not the island, with its association with the letter, and the first hard conversation. The actual table, where they ate dinner, where the surface was marked with the slight impressions of 3 years of daily life. I think you already know what I'm going to say, Natalie said. I think I do, he said. I need to say it anyway. He nodded. Okay. She said it. She said it the way she'd thought about it, without blaming him for things that were more complicated than blame, without rewriting their history into something purely negative, without performing a grief she didn't entirely feel or suppressing the grief she did. She told him that she loved him, and that love wasn't the question anymore. She told him that the question was whether the two of them could build something where both of them were fully present, both taking up the space they needed, and that she had come to believe the answer was no, not because he was a bad person, but because the pattern between them was too established, the grooves too deep, and she had spent too long learning to take up less space to trust that she could unlearn it while staying in the same structure. She told him she wanted to end the engagement. He didn't argue. He sat very still for a long moment, and she let the silence be what it was. I kept hoping, he said, that the apology would be enough, that I could recalibrate and that would fix it. I know you hope that. But you're saying it's not about whether I recalibrate. It's about whether I can be fully myself in this, she said. And I can't. I've tried to figure out how, and I keep coming back to the same answer. He was quiet again. His hands were flat on the table, not crossed, not gripping, just resting there, open. I don't want to fight you on this, he said. I know you don't. I want you to know that I... He stopped, started again. I'm proud of you. I know I have a strange way of showing it. I know what I did with the letters was the opposite of proud. But I want you to know that the pride was real, even when I was acting like it scared me. Natalie looked at him across the table. This was the part she hadn't expected. Not the anger she'd been faintly braced for, not the negotiation, but this. Ethan Cross sitting at a kitchen table in a plain shirt being honest about his own failure, in a way that had no strategic purpose. That matters, she said. I mean that. They talked for another hour, not about the engagement, but about the practicalities, the necessary arrangements of a shared life being carefully unshared. Who would stay in the apartment for how long? How to handle the people who'd need to be told? What to do about the ring? All of it was handled with a kind of mutual respect that felt like the last real thing they were giving each other, and she was grateful for it. He slept in the guest room that night without discussion. She lay in the bed that had been theirs and felt the space differently, not as loss exactly, but as space, as room, as something that had been compressed for a long time and was now allowed to expand back to its original shape. She didn't sleep well, but that had stopped surprising her. Monday's call with Kirkland lasted 55 minutes. She and David sat in his conference room with the phone on speaker, Natalie with her notes and her tablet and the particular focused patience she brought to negotiations, the willingness to sit in silence longer than the other side expected, to let Kirkland's reasonable-sounding proposals sit in the room without answering them immediately so their insufficiency could become apparent on its own. Kirkland was good. He was experienced. He was professional. He genuinely understood labor law, and he was trying very hard to get a deal that protected his client's interests while appearing to be more than it was. He offered back wages at 60% of the calculated amount. She said no. He offered reinstatement for 2 of the 3 terminated workers, arguing that the third had a performance record that complicated the matter. She said all 3. He offered a compliance review period of 1 year. She said 3 years with an independent monitor. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Ms. Hayes, Kirkland said, I want to be candid with you. My client is prepared to be reasonable, but the monitoring requirement as you've structured it is going to be a significant obstacle. I understand it's an obstacle, she said. It's designed to be. Not to my client, to anyone who considers doing this again to the next group of workers after this settlement is signed. Another pause. I'll take it back to my client. Please do, she said. We're ready to move toward trial if the terms aren't acceptable. The preliminary injunction record is strong. Discovery has been productive. She paused. Your client knows what's in those emails. A shorter pause this time. I'll be in touch by Thursday. She ended the call and looked at David. He was already writing something on his yellow legal pad. Thursday, he said. They're going to come back with something real on Thursday. They're going to try to split the monitoring, she said. 1 year with the threat of renewal rather than 3 years committed up front. Be ready for that. I'll be ready. She drove back to her own office with the window down and the late morning Los Angeles light coming in sideways, the way it did in November when the Santa Ana winds had passed and left the air scrubbed clean and bright. Everything looked unusually clear today. The palm trees, the billboard on Wilshire with its peeling corner, the woman at a crosswalk walking a very small dog with very large ears. She sent Adrian the 04 case summary as she'd promised, with a note. Board held. Developer not appealing. You won. His response came in 20 minutes. We won. You were half of that. More than half, honestly. She was not going to examine what it meant that she read that line twice. She had a full afternoon ahead of her, a client intake for a new matter, a call with her paralegal about a filing deadline, and a conversation she'd been putting off with the senior partner at her firm about a structural question that had been bothering her for months. She put her phone in her bag and went upstairs. The conversation with the senior partner, whose name was Greenberg, and who had hired her 4 years ago and considered himself something of a mentor in the measured way of people who are correct about their own judgment, often enough to be entitled to it, had been coming for a while. He was a good man and a careful attorney, and he ran the firm with a combination of pragmatism and genuine ethical commitment that was rarer than it should have been. But the firm was small, and it had its own gravitational pull, its own culture and limitations. And Natalie had been feeling for some time the specific friction of someone whose work was growing in a direction that didn't quite fit the space she was working in. She knocked on his open door, and he looked up from his reading glasses. You have that face, he said. What face? The face you have when you've already decided something and you're coming to tell me. He took his glasses off. Sit down. She sat. I've been thinking about the firm, she said, about the structure, about what I can take on and what I can't, and about where things are going for me professionally. And I think, she paused, organizing it. I think in the next year or so, I need to be somewhere that I'm not just an associate building toward partnership. I need to be making structural decisions about who we represent and how. Greenberg looked at her without surprise. You're thinking about going out on your own. I'm thinking about it. I'm not announcing it. I'm telling you because I respect you. And because you've been straight with me for 4 years, and the least I can do is be straight with you. He was quiet for a moment, turning his glasses in his hand. The warehouse case, he said. The kind of cases you're building toward. You can do those here. I can do the cases here, she said. I can't make the firm be the thing I need the firm to be. That's not a criticism of what it is. It's just that what it is and where I'm going aren't going to fit together neatly much longer. He sat back in his chair. He had the look of a man who was disappointed and also not surprised and had enough professional experience to separate those two responses from each other. You're not impulsive, he said, so I'll assume you've thought this through carefully. I've thought about it for 18 months. 18 months. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. And you're only telling me now. I'm only telling you now because I'm closer to ready than I was. He leaned forward. What do you need to be fully ready? The warehouse case concluded, she said. One more strong result on the record, and about 6 months. Then you have 6 months, he said, and you have my honest reference when you need it, which you will and which I will give without qualification. She looked at him across the desk. Thank you. Don't thank me, he said. Build something worth thanking. She walked back to her office with the afternoon light moving across the hallway floor and sat down at her desk and looked at the wall for a moment. At the framed order from the Delgado case, the first significant win she'd had on her own, the one that had gotten her a 2-paragraph mention in the LA Business Observer that Adrian Blake had apparently read. She was not there yet. She knew that. The warehouse case wasn't done, the Inglewood project wasn't secure. The apartment situation was still being navigated, and the thing she felt around Adrian Blake was still sitting in the place where she hadn't named it yet. But she was moving. She was moving in a direction she'd chosen for herself, and she knew what the next 6 months needed to look like, and she had enough ground under her feet to take the next step. Kirkland called Thursday as David had predicted. The offer was better. Not good enough? Not yet. But better. She made a counteroffer, left the monitoring at 3 years, held the line. He said he'd call back Friday. She said she'd be here. Kirkland called Friday at 4:53, which was itself information. The end of the business day, when people called with things they'd spent the week working up to. David was already in Natalie's office, sitting in the chair across from her desk with his legal pad, when her phone rang. She put it on speaker. "We've reviewed your counteroffer," Kirkland said. He had a voice that was professionally warm in the way of someone who'd learned warmth as a litigation tool. Not fake exactly, just deployed. "My client is prepared to accept full back wages as calculated. Reinstatement for all 3 terminated workers." And a pause that was just slightly too long. "A compliance monitoring period of 18 months with a renewal option at 12 months contingent on audit findings." Natalie looked at David. He wrote something on his pad and turned it toward her. "Not 3 years. Close." 18 months is not 3 years, she said. "The renewal mechanism effectively creates an open-ended monitoring period if the audits show continued issues," Kirkland said, "which my client believes they won't because my client believes the corrective measures being implemented are genuine." "Then your client shouldn't object to committing to 3 years up front," she said. "If the compliance is real, the monitoring costs them nothing." A silence. Not the calculating kind. The kind where someone on the other end of a phone is deciding how far he's authorized to go. "Give me until Monday morning," Kirkland said. "Monday morning," she said. 9 o'clock? She ended the call. David set down his pen. The late afternoon light was coming through the window at the particular angle it came at the end of short winter days, making the stack of files on her desk look like something out of a painting, all edges and shadows. "They're going to take it," David said. "I think so," she said. "But I want the 3 years in the final language, not a renewal option. Make sure our draft settlement agreement has that language locked before Monday." "Already drafted," he said. "I'll have it clean by Sunday." After he left, she sat for a while without doing anything in particular, a rare thing in her daily life, those minutes of simply being in a room without a task. The warehouse case had been 5 months from the first client call to here. 5 months of early mornings and late nights and parking lot conversations and documents that needed to be read 3 times before they gave up what they were hiding. It wasn't over yet. But she could see the edge of it now, and the edge was where she'd said it would be. She picked up her phone and sent Adrian a text. Not about the case, not about anything professional. Just, "Long week. How's the project?" He answered in 10 minutes. "Fenwick's attorneys filed a motion to reconsider. Expected. We have until the 15th to respond." "Are you free Sunday afternoon?" She looked at that question for a moment. "For the motion?" she typed. "For coffee," he wrote back. "The motion I can handle. Coffee, I apparently cannot figure out how to schedule without asking directly." She smiled at her phone in the way she didn't particularly want to examine. "Sunday works," she wrote. 2 o'clock. "I'll find somewhere without foil packet coffee," he said. She drove home on the 10 with the radio on low and let the week decompress in the way she'd learned to let it decompress. Not by analyzing it, just by driving and breathing and letting the city slide past. She moved out of the Cavendish apartment at the end of the month, she thought. She'd found a place in Silver Lake, smaller, no 11th floor, no professionally photographed kitchen, but with big windows and a good desk and enough room for her books and her files and herself. She'd signed the lease 2 weeks ago on a Tuesday morning before work, in the leasing office with a man named Marcus, who'd shown her the unit with an enthusiasm that was not performed, and she'd written the check with a hand that was steadier than she'd expected. Ethan had been professional and sad, and in the end, decent. He was staying in the apartment. The ring was in its box in a drawer in the bedroom. She'd left it there deliberately, on a morning when he was at the hospital, because handing it to him had felt too ceremonial for what they were doing, which was quietly and honestly ending a thing they'd both tried to make work. She'd texted him. "Ring is in the top drawer. It was always yours to give to someone else." He'd texted back, "Thank you for that." They hadn't spoken since except once, briefly, about logistics. It was not clean. None of it had been clean. But it had been honest, and honest was a standard she'd decided to hold herself to from here. Sunday she woke up at 7 and ran 3 miles, which she did badly because she'd slept poorly, and her right knee had been bothering her since a hiking trip the previous summer that she'd pushed farther than she should have. She came home and made coffee and stood at her new kitchen window. She'd moved in 4 days ago, and looked at the Silver Lake neighborhood coming to life in its Sunday way, which was slower and more human than the weekday way. The apartment was still half unpacked, boxes in the living room, books on the floor because the shelves weren't assembled yet, a stack of files on the kitchen table that she'd been meaning to organize for 3 days. It was objectively a mess. It also felt, in a way she hadn't expected, like somewhere she could breathe. She met Adrian at a coffee place in Los Feliz that he'd texted her the address for. Small, independent, the kind of place that had been there long enough to have regulars who came in without ordering because the person behind the counter already knew. He was there when she arrived, sitting at a table near the window with 2 cups already in front of him, which meant he'd either gotten there early or taken a guess on her order. "Oat milk, 1 sugar," he said when she sat down. "Based on what I observed at the gala, I could be wrong." "You're not wrong," she said. She picked up the cup. "That's either a good memory or mildly unsettling." "I'm going to go with good memory." She looked at him across the small table. He was in a flannel shirt and looked like someone who had also done something active that morning and not quite recovered from it. His hair slightly disheveled, a small smudge of something on his right hand that might have been graphite. He had the relaxed alertness of someone who is genuinely comfortable and also genuinely paying attention, which was a combination she found rarer than it should have been. "Tell me about the motion," she said. "Fenwick's attorneys are arguing that the board's decision exceeded its authority under the original development agreement, that the affordability commitments were contingent on certain financing conditions that have since changed, and that the board doesn't have jurisdiction to hold the developer to terms that were rendered void by those changes." "What's the financing structure?" He told her. She listened. It was a construction finance arrangement she'd encountered once before in a different context, a layered public-private deal with a state housing agency involved, which created jurisdictional complexity that Fenwick's attorneys were apparently planning to exploit. "The state agency involvement actually helps you," she said, "because it puts the project under the Housing Element Law Compliance Framework, and that framework has its own enforcement mechanisms that are independent of the original development agreement. They can argue the agreement terms are void all they want. The state law obligations aren't." He was quiet for a second. "I didn't know that." "Send me the state agency filing documents, the original ones from when the project was approved. I'll look at them this week." "You're not—" He paused. "This isn't your case. You did the board presentation as a favor." "I know. I can't keep asking you to work on this." "You didn't ask," she said. "I offered." She turned her coffee cup. "The people those units are supposed to house, what happens to them if Fenwick wins the motion?" He looked at his hands. "The affordability requirements get renegotiated at market rate conditions, which means most of the families who are on the waiting list for those units—" He stopped. "They don't get them. They find something else or they leave the area." "Then I'll look at the documents," she said. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was direct and unguarded in a way that she'd noticed before with him. No performance in it, no strategic deployment of warmth, just a person looking at another person and saying something true. "You know you don't have to keep proving yourself to me," he said. "I already think you're the most formidable person I've met in a professional context in probably 3 years." "I'm not proving anything," she said. "I'm interested in the problem." "Okay," he said. "I believe you." "Good." She drank her coffee. "Now tell me something that isn't about either of our work." He laughed. "That's a hard pivot." "It's Sunday." He thought for a moment with the genuine quality of someone actually considering the question. "I've been trying to teach myself to cook something other than the 4 things I know how to cook. This week I attempted a Vietnamese soup. It was not good. It was identifiably soup, but it was not good soup." "What went wrong?" "I think I skipped a step. The recipe said something about charring the ginger and onion, and I thought that sounded optional. It was apparently not optional." "It's not optional," she said. "It's the whole base of the flavor." He pointed at her. "You know Vietnamese cooking?" "My college roommate taught me. We had a kitchen the size of a coat closet, and she made things in it that had no business existing in that much square footage." She paused. "I haven't made anything like that in years. I've been in restaurants or eating at a desk or—" She stopped. "A long time." "A long time since you cooked for yourself?" "Or anything else that qualified as taking care of myself that wasn't just functional maintenance." He heard the weight in that without making it into something bigger than it was. "Are you taking care of yourself now?" he asked. "Better than I was," she said. They stayed in the coffee place for 2 hours. The conversation moved the way it always moved between them, in loops and tangents, following the thought to wherever it naturally went, without the social engineering of people trying to be impressive or memorable. She told him about moving to Silver Lake, and the unpacked boxes, and the knees she'd been ignoring. He told her about a project in his personal portfolio, not client work, just something he designed for himself. A small structure that was half house and half workspace, somewhere north of the city that he'd been sketching for 6 years and had never built. "Why haven't you built it?" she asked. He thought about it. Because building it means committing to it. As long as it's a sketch, it can be anything. Once you build it, it's the thing it is. That sounds like a reason not to do a lot of things. "Yeah," he said. "I'm aware of that." She drove home in the Sunday afternoon traffic with something sitting in her chest that she identified with her customary bluntness as simple happiness. Not transcendent or cinematic, just the ordinary happiness of 2 hours spent in good conversation with a person she was glad to know. She let it be what it was. Monday morning at 9:03, Kirkland called. 3 years. The language she'd asked for. A monitoring framework with teeth, conducted by an independent third-party auditor of her choosing from an approved list. Full-back wages for all 16 workers on the case. Reinstatement for all 3 terminated employees with clean records, no notation of the original terminations in their personnel files, and a company-wide training requirement on complaint handling procedures to be completed within 90 days. She looked at the draft settlement document David had prepared and went through it line by line while Kirkland waited on the phone, because she had learned early in her career that the worst place to catch a problem was after you'd expressed satisfaction with something. The language was what she'd asked for. It was solid. "We have an agreement," she said. She heard David sitting across from her exhale a breath he'd been holding for about 4 months. The formal signing took another week. Clients to brief, documents to review, signatures to collect. The procedural closing of a legal proceeding that had been 5 months of her life. She met with all 16 workers together in a conference room on a Tuesday afternoon, which was not something she always did with mass settlements, but which felt necessary here. She wanted them in the room together when she told them. She wanted them to see each other. Dolores was there. Rosario was there, in her regular day shift clothes, her hands folded on the conference table. The 3 reinstated workers were there. All 16. She walked them through the terms, back wages, timeline for payment, reinstatement procedures, monitoring schedule. She answered every question anyone had, including the ones that were more about reassurance than information. The questions that meant, "Are you sure? Is this real? Do we actually get to keep what we were promised?" "Yes," she said each time. "It's in the settlement. It's binding. It's enforceable." When she finished, Rosario said, not to the room, just quietly, the way Rosario said most things. 7 years. I've been there 7 years. "I know," Natalie said, "and they tried to take it. They did. And they couldn't." "They couldn't," Natalie said, "because you were all still here." Rosario nodded. That was enough. Natalie drove back to Greenberg's firm afterward and sat at her desk and stared at the far wall for a while, not in the exhausted way she sometimes sat and stared at nothing, but in the particular stillness of someone who has finished something real and is allowing themselves to understand that. She opened her desk drawer and looked at a notepad where she'd been writing, in pieces over the past few months, the bare structural outline of what a firm of her own would look like. Not a fantasy, a plan. Who the first clients would be, because she already knew. What practice areas, because she'd been building toward them. Where the office, because she'd been looking at spaces. What she'd call it, which was the only part still blank. She picked up a pen and thought for a moment. Hayes Law Group. She wrote it at the top of the page. Read it back. It was simple and it was correct, and it had her name on it without apology. She put the notepad back in the drawer. She told Greenberg that morning in his office. He took off his glasses, which she'd learned was his version of sitting up straight. "The warehouse case settled," she said. "I'm giving you 60 days' notice." 60 days, he said. "I'll finish everything currently active. I won't take on new matters after this week." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I'm going to ask you once if you're sure." "I want it on record that I asked." "I'm sure." "Then I want it on record that I tried." He put his glasses back on. "You'll need a good accountant. If you don't have one, my cousin does small firm work and he's honest, which is rarer than it sounds." She smiled. "Send me his number." Tit. The week she gave notice, Adrian called on a Wednesday evening. She was assembling one of the bookshelves that had been sitting in pieces in her Silver Lake apartment for 3 weeks, following the instructions with the focused irritation of someone who found furniture assembly inherently adversarial. She answered without checking the name first. "Am I interrupting?" he asked. "I'm losing an argument with a bookshelf," she said. What's up? I wanted to tell you before you heard it from somewhere else. Fenwick withdrew the motion. She set down the instruction sheet. Withdrew, not lost? Withdrew. His attorneys apparently looked at the state housing agency documents you sent me and concluded that pursuing the motion created more exposure than it resolved. They're proceeding with the project under the original terms. The full affordability commitment. The full commitment, all 38 units at the agreed income thresholds. He paused. You did that. The documents you found. That's what changed their calculation. You held the line, she said. For 8 months you held the line before I was involved. We both held the line, he said. I'm not going to argue about the proportion right now. She laughed. It came out naturally, which she noticed. I also wanted to ask you something, he said. He had that pause again, the genuine one, the collecting his thought pause. I'm going to dinner Saturday. A small thing, just a few people from the Inglewood Project team, Tamara, a couple of the community board members who voted with us, to mark the win. I'd like you to come. As part of the team? As yourself, he said, which is also part of the team, but mostly as yourself. She was holding the instruction sheet for the bookshelf and looking at the wall of her not yet finished apartment, and understanding, with the clarity she'd been cultivating since November, exactly what he was asking and exactly what she wanted to answer. What time? She said. 7. A place in Culver City. I'll text you the address. Okay, she said. After she hung up, she stood in the middle of her living room for a moment. The bookshelf parts were still on the floor. The boxes were still not unpacked. The notepad with Hayes Law Group written at the top was on the kitchen table where she'd left it after a long session of actual planning the night before. Staffing, funding, client pipeline. She picked up the instruction sheet and went back to the bookshelf. It took her another 40 minutes and 3 wrong turns in the instructions, and when she finally stood it upright and put it against the wall, it was slightly uneven, one of the feet not quite level on the hardwood floor, giving the whole thing a faint lean that she'd been meaning to address with a furniture pad but hadn't yet. She stepped back and looked at it. Uneven, not professionally assembled, nothing like the photograph in the catalog. She started putting books on it. The weight evened it out somewhat. Not perfectly, but enough. She worked through 3 boxes, making decisions about order. Not alphabetically, not by subject, just by some internal logic of what belonged near what. And by the time she'd emptied the boxes, it looked like a bookshelf where someone actually lived and thought and kept the things that mattered to them. She stepped back again. Better. She went to bed at 11 and slept through to 6:15, which was the best sleep she'd had since September. Saturday's dinner was at a restaurant in Culver City that occupied a converted warehouse space with exposed brick and lights strung from the rafters and long communal tables that encouraged the kind of sideways conversation that moved between people rather than being locked in pairs. Tamara was there with 2 women from the advocacy group, a man named Robert, who'd been the community board member most vocal in their support, the one who'd been taking notes during Natalie's presentation with the careful intensity of someone building an argument as they listened. The project engineer from Adrian's firm, a young woman named Sophie who was 26 and had the energy of someone doing exactly what she'd trained to do. Adrian was already there when Natalie arrived, talking to Robert, and he spotted her at the door and came over without doing the thing people sometimes did at events like this, the theatrical delay that was designed to make arrival seem casual. You made it, he said. You keep saying that, she said. Like you're surprised. I keep being proven right, that I don't need to be surprised, he said. He took her coat and found a hook near the wall for it, and introduced her to Robert and Sophie and a woman named Dana from the advocacy group, and in each introduction he said her name first and led with what she did, the same way he'd done at the gala. Natalie Hayes, labor attorney, she's the reason Fenwick's attorneys backed down, and each time she felt the small, uncomplicated pleasure of being introduced as what she was. The evening was easy. Not in the way that easy evenings sometimes were, the slick, performative ease of people being charming at each other, but in the way of people who had done something real together and could sit in the fact of it without needing to perform. They ate well. They argued about city politics with the specific passion of people who lived in the consequences of those politics. Tamara had opinions about the mayor that she was not going to soften for anyone at the table, and nobody wanted her to. Robert asked Natalie about the warehouse case settlement. She told him. He asked careful, intelligent questions, the kind that came from someone who understood that policy happened in specific people's specific lives, and wanted to know where the two intersected. "You're starting your own firm," Adrian said at some point. Not as a question, she'd mentioned it to him on the phone during the week, and he'd filed it away. "In about 60 days, she said. "What kind of firm?" "Labor and employment primarily, immigration adjacent. Workers in industries that tend to get low-wage, high-turnover treatment from employers who count on people not having the resources to fight." Robert looked at her. "You should talk to the building trades union about a partnership. They've been looking for outside counsel who actually knows this space." "Send me the contact," she said. Tamara was already writing something on a business card. "And this is the director of the Immigrant Worker Center in Boyle Heights. She's been trying to find an attorney she can refer people to for 2 years. Natalie took the card. She was aware, in a quietly moved way, of what was happening. The network assembling itself not through strategy, but through doing the work in front of people who paid attention to the work. She hadn't come to the dinner to build anything. She'd come because she was asked by someone she wanted to spend an evening near. And the rest was just the way things worked when you were moving in the right direction. At some point later in the evening, when the table had broken into smaller conversations, and the restaurant had gotten louder with the Saturday night crowd, Adrian turned to her and said, low enough that it was just for her, "How does it feel?" "All of it. The settlement, the firm, the—" He gestured vaguely at the general shape of her life. She thought about it honestly, the way she'd been trying to do. "Like something that's mine," she said. "For the first time in a while. Like something that's actually mine." He held her gaze for a moment. "It shows," he said. She looked back at him and said nothing, which was itself a kind of answer, the particular silence of two people who understand something without needing to say it yet, and who are both patient enough to wait for the right moment instead of rushing toward it. The evening ended the way good evenings ended, not dramatically, just gradually, people gathering coats and lingering near the door in the way people lingered when they didn't quite want to let the thing go. Tamara hugged Natalie on the way out and said, "You're one of us now," in a way that was genuinely meant. Robert shook her hand. Sophie, who had sat next to her for most of the night and had been wonderfully direct about everything she thought, said, "I hope our firm gets to work with yours someday." "I'll make sure of it," Natalie said, outside on the Culver City sidewalk with the Saturday night air on their faces. It was just her and Adrian waiting for their respective car services, parked in different directions, leaving in different directions. The ordinary geometry of two people whose lives hadn't yet arranged themselves around each other. "Thank you for coming," he said. "Thank you for asking." A pause, not uncomfortable, the kind of pause that has something in it. "I'd like to do this again," he said. "Not a dinner with a group, just this. Whatever this is." She looked at him. The streetlight was doing something ordinary to his face that made him look exactly as he was, a person trying to say something true without dressing it up. "Just us," she said. "Just us." She thought about everything that had happened in the last 5 months. The envelope under the bills, the gala, the speech, the conversation at the kitchen table, the warehouse settlement, the Silver Lake apartment, the bookshelf that leaned slightly and held all her books anyway. She thought about standing in a parking lot and making decisions that had cost something and been worth it. "I'd like that too," she said. His car arrived first. He said goodnight and walked toward it, and just before he got in he turned back once, not dramatically, not with any particular weight, just looked at her for a moment the way you look at something you're going to remember. She watched his car pull away. Then she looked up at the Culver City sky, which was never actually dark in Los Angeles, always that particular bruised orange of light reflected off cloud and smog and city, the color of a place that never fully went to sleep. Her car came 5 minutes later. She got in and went home to the apartment with the slightly uneven bookshelf and the boxes that still needed unpacking and the notepad with her name written at the top of a plan. She was ready, finally, to actually build. Hayes Law Group opened its doors on a Monday in March, which was not a ceremonial choice. It was just the first Monday after the office lease started, and the filing cabinet arrived and the internet was connected, and there was no longer any logistical reason to wait. The office was on the second floor of a building in Echo Park, 3 blocks from the diner where Natalie and Carmen had been having lunch since law school, which felt less like symbolism and more like practical geography. 2 rooms and a small reception area. A window that looked out over a parking lot, and beyond it, a sliver of the reservoir if you stood at the right angle. She had painted the walls herself the previous weekend. Not because she couldn't afford to hire someone, but because she'd wanted to. Carmen had come over Saturday morning with rollers and drop cloths and the specific energy she brought to physical tasks. Efficient, slightly bossy, fully committed, and they'd worked through 2 coats of a warm gray while Carmen offered opinions on everything from the paint color to the font on the business cards to the paragraph structure of the firm's intake form. "The intake form is too formal," Carmen had said, crouching near the baseboard with a small brush. "It reads like you're already preparing for litigation. People call a lawyer for the first time and they're scared. The first form they fill out should not make them feel like they're already losing." "It's an intake form," Natalie said from the stepladder. "It's the first thing a person sees when they decide to ask for help. Make it feel like someone's going to listen." Natalie had revised it that night. Carmen was right. The first week was quieter than she'd expected and louder than she'd feared. 2 calls came in through the website, which her paralegal Marcus, who had followed her from Greenberg's firm and was worth more than she was paying him and knew it, had set up with a clarity and simplicity that made her embarrassed about how long she'd worked for a firm with a website that required a law degree to navigate. One of the calls was a referral from the Building Trades Union contact Robert had given her at the Culver City dinner. The other was from the Immigrant Worker Center in Boyle Heights, Tamara's referral, the card she'd been given on a Saturday night and had followed up on the following Tuesday morning. She took both consultations herself. A young man named Felix, who had been doing construction work under a contractor who had been paying him in cash at below minimum wage, and had recently, when Felix had asked about it, suggested that Felix might want to reconsider whether he wanted to continue working there. And a woman named Anna Bernal, 44 years old, who had been in the United States for 19 years on a work visa renewal cycle that had been managed by her employer, and who had recently discovered that her employer had failed to file the most recent renewal on time, leaving her status in jeopardy through no action of her own. Both of them sat across from Natalie in the Echo Park office and looked at her the same way Rosario had once looked at her across a parking lot, with the careful, cautious hope of people who had been living with a problem for long enough to have stopped expecting it to resolve. She told Felix what she could do for him and what the timeline would look like, and what she needed from him to start. She told Anna the same. She was direct and honest about the difficulty of Anna's case, the immigration timeline, the employer's potential liability, the parallel tracks they'd have to run simultaneously. She did not make promises she couldn't keep. She told them both, "I'm going to work on this as hard as I know how. That's what I can honestly offer you." Felix had nodded. Anna had looked at her hands and then back up and said, "That's more than anyone has said to me in a year." After they both left, Natalie stood at the parking lot window for a moment and thought about that. That's more than anyone has said to me in a year. Not thank you for the good news or thank you for fixing it, just someone finally said something true to me. Someone finally sat down and told me what was real. She went back to her desk and started working. The thing about building something from the ground floor was that the ground floor was genuinely unglamorous. She had known this intellectually. Knowing it and living it were different experiences. There were weeks when the billing was thin. There was a filing she got wrong, not substantively, but procedurally. A form that needed to be refiled with a correction that cost 2 days, and a conversation with a federal agency clerk who was not unkind, but was also not interested in the explanation for why the error had happened. There was a client who stopped returning her calls after 3 weeks of active work on his case, which left her in the uncomfortable position of not knowing whether he was okay or had simply changed his mind, both of which were his right, neither of which stopped her from occasionally checking her phone. She hired a second attorney in June, a woman named Preeti Anand, who had spent 4 years at a large firm doing employment litigation, and had grown tired, as she put it in her interview with a bluntness that Natalie appreciated, of being the person who helped corporations beat the people she actually wanted to help. Preeti was precise, slightly impatient with inefficiency, and had a memory for case law that bordered on unsettling. She also made excellent coffee, which she brought in a thermos every morning and shared without being asked, which turned out to matter more for office culture than Natalie would have predicted. "This intake form is good," Preeti said, on her first day, reading through the firm's client-facing documents. "Who wrote it?" "I did," Natalie said, "with input. The language doesn't sound like a lawyer." "That was the goal." Preeti looked up. "I'm going to like it here," she said. By July, the Felix case had resolved, a back wages settlement with the contractor that was not large in dollar terms, but was correct in every particular. and that had been documented in a way that created a record useful for the broader investigation the labor commissioner was now conducting into the contractor's practices across multiple work sites. Felix had shaken Natalie's hand at the conclusion and said, in a mixture of English and Spanish that she understood entirely, "I didn't think this was going to work. I'm sorry I doubted you." "You had every reason to doubt," she said. "Doubt is sensible when you've been let down." Anna's case was slower and harder and still in motion at the end of summer, because immigration cases lived on their own timeline, and that timeline respected nothing except its own procedural requirements. But the employer's liability exposure had been established, a corrective filing had been made, and the status question was moving through the appropriate channels in a way that was at least moving rather than stalled. Anna called every 3 weeks to check in. Not anxiously, just steadily, the check-in of someone who has decided to trust the process and wants to maintain contact with the person managing it. "You still there?" Anna said, on one of those calls, which had become a kind of ritual opening. "Still here," Natalie said. "Okay," Anna said. "Okay, I'll talk to you in 3 weeks." Boss. Adrian came to the office once, in late April, to drop off the South Central project documents she'd asked for. A stack of folders that he could have sent digitally, but had offered to bring himself on a Tuesday afternoon when he happened to be in Echo Park for a site visit nearby. He stood in the reception area and looked around at the office, the walls, the window, the slightly overfull bookshelf that Marcus had assembled with more competence than Natalie had assembled the one in her apartment. "It looks like you," he said. "Is that good?" "It's exactly good." He handed her the folders. "The files you asked for, and I included the state agency correspondence from the original approval. You mentioned needing the full chain." "I did mention that." "I also included something I didn't mention." He nodded at the folder on top. "An article about a labor attorney in Echo Park who recently won a settlement for 16 warehouse workers. It ran in the California Labor Review last week. I thought you might not have seen it." She opened the top folder. Inside was a printout of the article, with a post-it note in his handwriting that said, "Told you," 2 words. She looked at them for a long moment. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," he said. "I just printed it." They had been having dinner on and off since the Culver City evening in October, not with any formal announcement of what it was. Just dinners that became a regular thing, conversations that picked up exactly where they'd left off, the easy accumulation of time spent with a person you wanted to spend time with. She had cooked for him once, at her Silver Lake apartment, and had made a Vietnamese soup with the full process, including the properly charred ginger and onion, and he had eaten 2 bowls and been genuinely humbled by the difference it made. "I skipped a foundational step," he said about his earlier attempt. "You skipped the step that makes everything else work," she said. He had looked at her over his bowl. "Are we still talking about soup?" "We're talking about soup," she said. "Mostly." There was a quality to what they were building that she found difficult to name precisely, and had stopped trying to name, because naming it felt like trying to pin down something that was still in motion and was better experienced in motion than classified. What she knew was that he was interested in her, in the full-dimensional version of her, the one with the knee that bothered her, and the filing error, and the client who stopped calling, and the moment in the parking lot with Rosario, and the speech from the bottom of a staircase, and all of it. He was interested in who she was when things didn't work, not just when they did. And she was interested in him the same way. The housing project that had taken 8 months to protect. The structure he'd been sketching for 6 years and hadn't built yet. The way he admitted to not knowing things without using the admission as performance. The way he looked at a problem, any problem, with the patience of someone who understood that most structures worth building required more time than originally planned. They were imperfect people doing real things in a real city, and finding that they fit together better than either of them had known how to expect. The second year of Hayes Law Group was different from the first in the specific way that second years were always different. The initial scramble had become a rhythm, the rhythm had become a practice, and the practice had started to develop the kind of reputation that built itself incrementally through work rather than announcement. The Building Trades Union partnership had grown from one referral contact into a formal retainer relationship. The Boyle Heights Immigrant Worker Center sent cases every month. A story in the LA Times about the warehouse settlement, a longer piece than the one in the California Labor Review, with testimony from Rosario and Dolores, had produced 17 new inquiry calls in 2 weeks, which had nearly broken Marcus's scheduling system, and which Natalie had responded to by hiring a third attorney, a man named Tom Shields, who was 61 years old and had practiced labor law for 30 years, and was, as he explained in his interview, not retired but tired of working for people who didn't understand what the law was for. "What do you think the law is for?" Natalie had asked him. He had looked at her with the expression of someone who'd been asked a question they'd answered internally 10,000 times and had stopped expecting anyone to ask out loud. "It's the mechanism by which people with less power make claims on people with more power," he said. "In theory, the rest is argument about whether the mechanism actually works." "Does it work?" "Sometimes," he said. "More often when someone's fighting hard on the right side of it." She hired him on the spot. Pretty and Tom developed a working relationship that was built primarily on mutual respect and the occasional vigorous disagreement about strategy, and both of them were better attorneys for having someone in the room who pushed back. The office had a particular energy now, not a startup energy, nothing frenetic or performed, but the energy of a place where work was being done that people believed in. Carmen came to lunch in November, exactly 1 year after the gala, at the same diner in Echo Park. She sat across from Natalie in the same patched vinyl booth and looked at her for a long moment before saying anything. "You look different," Carmen said. "I'm a year older." "Not that. You look like yourself. The self you were in law school before you started modifying it for other people's preferences." Natalie turned her coffee cup. "I didn't realize I'd stopped looking like that." "I know," Carmen said. "That's what I mean." They talked about the firm. They talked about Carmen's own caseload, which had recently included a custody matter so complicated it had required a forensic accountant, and about the forensic accountant who was apparently fascinating in the specific way that people were fascinating when they'd spent years learning to read financial deception the way other people read body language. They talked about Carmen's new apartment and Natalie's apartment and what it meant to be women in their early 30s who had structured their lives around their own needs, and were still sometimes surprised by how much resistance that generated from people who hadn't been asked. "How's Adrian?" Carmen said, with the specific neutrality she used when she wanted information without appearing to want it. "Good," Natalie said. "Really good." Carmen waited. Natalie considered how to say it. "We're taking it at our own pace, which is the right pace. Neither of us is in a hurry to define everything before it's ready to be defined." "But you know what it is." "I know what it is," she said. "I'm not in any confusion about what it is." "Good," Carmen said, abandoning the neutrality entirely. "Because he introduced you as his partner to someone at a city planning meeting last month, and Tamara told me, and I've been waiting 2 weeks for you to bring it up." Natalie looked at her. "He did?" "His partner, Natalie Hayes, the labor attorney." Carmen smiled into her coffee. "Apparently he said it completely matter-of-factly, like it was just an accurate description." She thought about that for a moment. About a man who introduced her by her work in every room, who had apparently been describing her accurately in rooms she hadn't been in, who had not asked her permission to do it because it was just the true thing, and he saw no reason to ask permission to say a true thing. She thought about the distance between that and a man who had buried an envelope with her name on it under a stack of bills. The distance was not small. "He could have told me," she said. "Maybe he was going to," Carmen said, or maybe he just didn't think of it as a declaration. Maybe he thought it was just what you are." She sat with that for a moment, and then she did something she hadn't done in a long time, something that used to come easily, before she'd learned to modulate herself down into the shape of a woman who held her feelings carefully and presented them only when they were useful. She let herself feel it, simply, without analysis. The fact of it. She told Adrian about it that evening. They were on the phone. She was driving home. He was at his studio, which he sometimes stayed in until 8 or 9 when he was deep in a project. She'd gotten into the habit of calling him on the drive home, and he'd gotten into the habit of picking up. "I heard you introduced me to someone at a city planning meeting," she said. A pause. Not guilty. Just caught slightly off guard. "Tamara," he said. "Tamara." "I introduced you as my partner," he said. "I realize I used that word without... We haven't specifically..." He stopped. Started again, because Adrian Blake, when confronted with a significant personal conversation, did not retreat into vagueness. "I used the word because it felt accurate, but I should have talked to you about it before I used it in rooms you weren't in." "I'm not upset," she said. "Okay. I'm asking because I want to know if it was intentional." A brief pause. "Yes," he said. "It was intentional." She was on the 101, the city spread out around her, the last of the daylight finishing its exit over the Pacific somewhere to her left. The traffic was thick and slow and orange lit and completely ordinary. "Then it's accurate," she said. She could hear him in the pause, the quality of it, the held breath that wasn't quite a held breath. "Yeah?" he said. "Yeah," she said. "It's accurate." There was a moment of quiet between them that had everything in it and didn't need to be spoken because it was already understood. The kind of quiet that can only exist between two people who've been building towards something carefully and have just discovered they've arrived. "I'm going to build the structure," he said. "The one I've been sketching. The one north of the city. I've been using the excuse that I didn't want to commit to it, but I think the real reason was that I wasn't sure who I was building it for." Another pause. "I think I know now." She pulled off at her exit and navigated the surface streets toward Silver Lake, and they talked for another 20 minutes, not about the structure, not about what it meant, just about the week, about a case Tom was handling that had an interesting wrinkle, about a community meeting Adrian had coming up on Thursday, about the soup recipe she was planning to try that weekend with a variation Carmen had suggested involving a different kind of mushroom. Ordinary things, their things. So the LA Young Professionals Council called in December. Not the same letter, a phone call from the council's events director, a woman named Judith, who had a brisk warmth that was efficient and genuine simultaneously. She explained that the council was hosting its annual retrospective gathering, an event for all past honorees, and that this year's program was planning to include a segment on the professional journeys of selected prior recipients, and Natalie's name had been raised as someone whose trajectory since receiving the award had been particularly significant. "We'd like you to speak," Judith said. 10 minutes, about what the year has looked like, where you were when you received the award, and where you are now. 10 minutes is short, Natalie said. "We found that people who have something real to say it more clearly in 10 minutes than in 30, Judith said. "And from what I've heard about you, you have something real to say." She said yes. She did not prepare extensively. She thought about what was true and she wrote 3 notes on a card. Not a speech, just anchors to return to if she lost the thread, and trusted, as the woman from the council staff had told her the previous year, that speaking from where she was would be enough. The event was at the same downtown theater, the same chandeliers, the same restored floors, the same ceilings that the original architects had built high on purpose. She wore a different dress this year, dark green, equally intentional, chosen on a Saturday morning at a different boutique in a different mood. A year's worth of different. Adrian came with her, not as an escort, not as a +1 in the ceremonial sense, just as a person she'd asked to be there because she wanted him there, and he'd said yes the same way he said yes to things, without making a production of it, because yes was just the true answer, and he'd learned not to dress up true answers. They arrived together, and the same small crowd and the same velvet ropes were there, and when the photographer called her name, she stood for the photograph, and Adrian stood beside her, not centered, not performing, just present, the way he was present in everything. Inside, she saw people she recognized from the previous year and met new honorees and talked about the kind of work she'd been doing in the language she'd developed over the past year. Clear, specific, without apology or inflation. People asked about the firm, and she told them. A woman asked about the warehouse case settlement, and she told her. A young man, 25, 26, recently minted attorney, asked her what it had been like to start a firm at 30, and she told him that too, including the filing error and the thin billing weeks and the client who stopped calling, because those were the parts that told the truth about what it actually looked like. "You don't make it sound easy," he said. "It isn't," she said. "It's worth it. Those aren't the same thing." When her name was called and she walked to the stage, she was aware of the room in a different way than she'd been the previous year. Not nervous, not braced, just present. Adrian was at a table near the center. He caught her eye as she went up the steps and didn't do anything theatrical, just looked at her with the expression that meant, "I see you," and it was more than enough. She stood at the podium. "A year ago, I stood in this room and I said that this award belonged to every client who trusted me when they had every reason not to trust anyone." She looked out at the faces. "I've been thinking about that a lot this year, about trust, about what it means to be trusted by someone who's been let down before." She paused. "I started a firm this year. 2 attorneys. Now 3. We work with people who pack lunches and take buses and ask for what they were promised and are told that what they were promised doesn't count anymore. We work with people whose immigration status was mishandled by an employer they trusted for years. We work with people who are afraid to be seen fighting for themselves because being seen might cost them the job they can't afford to lose. A pause. The cases are hard. The hours are strange. There's a filing cabinet in my office that I'm still not sure is level, and a bookshelf in my apartment that definitely isn't, and a client I haven't heard from since April who I still think about. Nothing about this is clean. She looked at the room. But every time someone sits across from me in that Echo Park office and decides to trust me with a problem they've been carrying alone for too long, I understand again why I do this. Not the idea of it, the actual fact of it, the specific person, the specific problem, the specific life at stake. She felt the room. It was with her. Not applause, not yet, just the attentive silence of people following something that was real. I'm not going to tell you it's been perfect, she said. I'm going to tell you it's been mine. And for the first time in a long time, I can stand somewhere and say that without a single reservation. This is my work. This is my name on the door. These are my clients. This is my life. She paused. That should be ordinary. I think for a lot of people here tonight, in this room, it might not feel ordinary yet. It didn't feel ordinary to me, but it's available. It's available to you. She stepped back from the podium. Thank you. The applause was warm and full, and she received it the same way she'd received the award the previous year. Not deflecting, not inflating, just standing in it. She walked off the stage. Adrian was waiting at the bottom, not with a glass of water this time, just standing there with his hands in his pockets, and the expression of a person who has just witnessed something that mattered to them. That was better than last year, he said. I had more material, she said. He smiled. She smiled back. And they walked together into the room, not with ceremony, not with any particular significance attached to the walking itself, just two people moving through a room they both belonged in, side by side, at the same pace. Months passed. The way months passed when you were inside a life that was actually yours, quickly, with texture, without the strange suspended quality that time had when you were living someone else's version of it. Rosario got a raise, unsolicited, issued quietly by a new HR director who had come in as part of the compliance monitoring requirement. It arrived as a line item in her February paycheck, and she called Natalie to make sure it wasn't a mistake. It's not a mistake, Natalie said. They don't have to do that, Rosario said. The settlement didn't require that. No, Natalie said. It didn't. A silence. Okay, Rosario said. Okay. Ana Bernal's status was resolved in March. A clean renewal, employer liability documented and settled through a separate administrative proceeding that had cost the employer considerably more than a timely filing would have. When it was done, Ana came to the Echo Park office and sat across from Natalie and said nothing for a moment, just looked at her with the particular expression of someone who has been carrying a weight for a long time and is still getting used to its absence. What happens now? Ana asked. Now you live your life, Natalie said, without that hanging over it. Ana nodded slowly. I forgot what that felt like. I know, Natalie said. You'll remember. The South Central Housing Project broke ground in April. Natalie went to the groundbreaking, not as a speaker, just as someone who'd played a part and wanted to see the moment happen. Tamara was there. Robert was there. 30 community members who had been on the waiting list for affordable units stood in a vacant lot in the April sun and watched an architect and a developer shake hands in front of a sign that described, in plain language, what was going to be built here and for whom. Adrian stood beside the sign in his hard hat, the same one from his firm's website photograph, squinting into the sun in the same way. He was talking to the project engineer and the community board chair simultaneously and managing both conversations with the ease of someone who had been doing this long enough to understand that the conversation between the builder and the community was the project, not a precondition of it. He caught her eye across the vacant lot, and a look passed between them. The specific look of two people who have worked on something together and are watching it become real, the look that contains everything it took to get here without requiring any of it to be said. After the groundbreaking, they drove north on the Pacific Coast Highway with the windows down. It was his idea. He wanted to show her the land he'd bought, finally, for the structure he'd been sketching for 6 years. It was about 2 hours north of the city, accessible by a road that was more suggestion than commitment, and when he stopped the car and they got out onto a hillside with a view of the Pacific and the late afternoon light doing something extraordinary with the water and the grass, she understood why he'd been sketching it for 6 years. "This is it," she said. "This is it," he said. They stood there for a while, not talking. The wind off the Pacific was steady and cool, and the grass moved in it, and the light kept changing the way light changed on that coast, cycling through versions of itself. "When are you going to build it?" she asked. "I applied for the permits last month," he said. "I'm serious this time." "I know," she said. "I know you are." He turned to look at her. He had the expression he got when he was about to say something true and was deciding how to say it simply. "I kept a sketch of it on my drafting table for 6 years, he said. "I told myself I was waiting until the design was right, but the design has been right for 4 years. He paused. "I was waiting for this to feel like the right life to build it in." She looked at him. "Does it?" she said. "Yeah," he said. "It does." The Pacific moved below them. The light kept changing. She reached over and took his hand, not dramatically, just took it, the way you take something that is yours without needing to make a ceremony of the taking. They stood there until the sun got low enough that the temperature dropped, and the practical reality of a 2-hour drive asserted itself over the view. On the way back, somewhere south of Malibu, with the city beginning to accumulate on the horizon, she thought about all the things that had led to this moment, and not in the neat retrospective way, where everything looks inevitable, in the messy, real way. The envelope under the bills, the dress she'd bought because it entered a room before she did, the speech she'd given without extensive preparation because she had something true to say. The conversation at the kitchen table that had been honest and painful and necessary. The filing cabinet that might not be level. The bookshelf that definitely wasn't. The clients who trusted her with problems they'd been carrying alone. None of it had been clean. None of it had been easy. And every bit of it had been hers. There was a version of her life. The version she'd been building in the Cavendish apartment. The version organized around someone else's ambitions and someone else's comfort with how much space she was allowed to take up. That would have been fine. Livable. Presentable. The version that looked correct from the outside, that had the right address and the right ring and the right narrative shape for a 30-year-old attorney engaged to a heart surgeon. That version had no room in it for the woman she actually was. The woman she actually was took 2 buses to meet with workers in parking lots, stayed late on cases that didn't bill enough, put her name on a door, made soup with the foundational step included, stood at a podium and said, "This is my work, this is my name, this is my life," without a single reservation. You didn't find that woman by looking for her. You found her by refusing, long enough and at sufficient cost, to be anyone else. Adrian merged onto the freeway, and the radio came on low, something unhurried, something with a good rhythm. And she leaned back in the seat and watched the city come toward them in the particular way the city came toward you when you were returning to it from somewhere you'd needed to go. She was 31 years old. She had a firm with 3 attorneys and a paralegal and a filing cabinet of uncertain levelness and a growing case docket and a name on the door. She had a Silver Lake apartment with an uneven bookshelf that held all her books. She had clients who called every 3 weeks to check in, and clients who had gotten their back wages, and clients still mid-process who trusted her to stay the course. She had Carmen across a diner booth. She had Preeti's thermos of good coffee in the mornings, and Tom's 30 years of knowing what the law was actually for. And she had this. A man beside her who had introduced her as his partner in a room she wasn't in, because it was just the accurate word for what she was, and who was going to build something on a hillside above the Pacific in the life they were making together. She had not become smaller. She had not become quieter. She had not made herself easier to manage or less complicated to love. She had become more herself, more completely, more clearly, more without apology, and the life that had grown around that was not perfect and not finished, and not without its hard weeks and wrong turns and clients who stopped calling. But it was hers. That was the whole thing, finally. That was what she'd been trying to find her way back to since the night she'd pulled a gold-sealed envelope out from under a stack of bills and understood, for the first time, how long she'd been allowing herself to disappear. Real love, the kind worth having, the kind worth building a life inside of, did not ask you to be less. It did not hide your name. It did not calculate the cost of your visibility. It stood beside you in rooms and described you accurately and made space for you to take up exactly as much room as you needed. And the work that was worth doing, the kind that kept you up at night and brought you back every morning, did not make you feel small either. It made you feel the particular weight of something real, the weight of a problem that matters, a person who trusts you, a name on a door you put there yourself. She had both of those things. She had earned both of them. Not gracefully, not without error, not on the first try, but she had earned them. The city opened up around the car as they came down out of the hills. Los Angeles at night, impossibly large and luminous and indifferent, full of people in small rooms and large ambitions and lives of every description. Full of workers who packed lunches and took buses, full of buildings that were being designed right now by people who believed that where you lived shaped what you could become. Full of conversations happening in diner booths and parking lots and Echo Park offices and hillsides above the Pacific where the light did something extraordinary with the water. Natalie Hayes watched it all come toward her and felt, simply and without ceremony, like herself. Like completely herself. That was enough. It had always been enough. She just hadn't known for a while that she was allowed to say so.